On a warm summer morning in 1966, three children left their home for the beach. They packed towels. They carried coins for the bus. They promised to be back by lunchtime. They were never seen again. No screams were reported. No signs of violence were found. No physical evidence was ever recovered. More than half a century later, the case remains unsolved. This is the disappearance of the Beaumont. January 26, 1966, began like countless other summer mornings in Adelaide. It was Australia Day, a public holiday, and the city moved at a slower pace than usual. Shops opened later. Streets were quieter. Families stayed home or made plans for the beach, barbecues, and small celebrations that marked the middle of summer. The heat had already settled in early that morning, not oppressive yet, but steady and familiar. The kind of warmth people expected in January. The kind that made the idea of the ocean feel inevitable. In the coastal suburb of Somerton Park, the Beaumont household was quiet. There was no sense of urgency, no tension, no sign that this day would be remembered for anything other than its ordinariness. Inside the house, the rhythm of a typical morning unfolded. Small movements, familiar routines, children waking up, talking over one another, moving from room to room with the restless energy that came from having a day off from school. Jane Beaumont, the eldest at 9 years old, had already begun to take on responsibilities beyond her age. She was careful, observant, and protective of her younger siblings. Her mother trusted her, not because she had to, but because Jane had earned that trust over time. 7-year-old Arna followed her sister closely. Where Jane went, Arna was usually not far behind. She was talkative, curious, and eager to be involved in whatever her older sister was doing. Grant, the youngest at 4, was small enough to still be absorbed in the simple excitement of the moment. For him, the world was immediate and uncomplicated. A beach trip meant sand, water, and movement. Nothing more. The idea of going to Glenelg Beach was not unusual. The children had done it before. They knew the route. They knew which bus to take. They knew how much the fare cost. Their mother had taught them what to do and what not to do. They understood where they were allowed to go and when they were expected to return. This was not a reckless decision. It was a decision shaped by routine. In the mid-1960s, this kind of independence was normal. Children walked to school alone. They rode public transport. They spent afternoons outside, often unsupervised, moving between familiar places and returning home when they were told. The world did not yet feel dangerous in the way it would later come to feel. Crime existed, but it did not dominate public consciousness. Parents worried about traffic accidents, scraped knees, and sunburn far more than they worried about strangers. Somerton Park itself was quiet and residential. Streets lined with modest houses, neighbors who recognized one another, a place where children moving freely did not stand out. When the children asked their mother if they could go to the beach that morning, there was nothing unusual in the request. It was reasonable. It was expected. It fit the day. She agreed. She gave them money for the bus. She reminded them to come home by early afternoon. She trusted them to do what they had always done before. Nothing about the exchange felt significant at the time. There was no hesitation. No lingering concern. No sense that this decision needed reconsideration. It was simply another ordinary moment in a family's routine. At approximately 10 a.m., the children left the house. They walked together, as they always did. Jane leading, Arna beside her, Grant following closely behind. 3 figures moving down the street toward a bus stop they knew well. This moment, quiet, unremarkable, unrecorded, would later become the most important moment in the entire case. Because it was the last confirmed time anyone in their family ever saw them. At the time, no one knew that. Their mother returned to her day. The neighborhood carried on as usual. The city continued celebrating a public holiday. Somewhere between Somerton Park and Glenelg Beach, the Beaumont children passed from routine into history. The bus ride itself would have been uneventful. Public transport on a holiday morning was lightly used. Families heading to the beach, individuals heading into town. The children would not have drawn attention. They were clean, well-dressed, calm. Nothing about them suggested distress. When the bus arrived at Glenelg, the children stepped off into a place that was already active. Glenelg Beach was one of Adelaide's most popular destinations. Wide stretches of sand, nearby shops, cafes, arcades, a place designed for people to gather. On that morning, it was populated with families, couples, and children, people swimming, walking, sitting under umbrellas, watching the water. In later years, many would struggle to understand how 3 children could vanish from such a public space. But public does not mean observed. Crowds create anonymity. Movement creates blind spots. Familiarity creates assumptions. Multiple witnesses would later report seeing the Beaumont children at the beach. They were playing near the water. They appeared relaxed. They appeared happy. Several witnesses noticed something else. The children were speaking with a man. He did not appear threatening. He did not appear hurried. He did not appear hurried. He did not appear out of place. According to those who saw him, the interaction looked natural, casual, almost parental. The children were not avoiding him. They were not distressed. They were not trying to leave. This detail would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case, because it suggested that whatever followed did not begin with force. It suggested trust. The man was described as well-spoken and neatly dressed, taller than average, well-built, someone who looked respectable, particularly by the standards of the time. In the 1960s, appearance carried weight. Respectability disarmed suspicion. No one intervened. No one questioned the interaction. There was nothing to intervene in. At some point during the day, Jane Beaumont was reportedly seen inside a nearby bakery. She purchased food for herself and her siblings. What stood out was the money. She paid using a £1 note. This immediately raised questions. £1 was a significant amount for a child. Her parents insisted they had not given her that much money. The implication was obvious. Someone else had. But that transaction left no paper trail, no receipt, no surveillance footage. It existed only in memory. As the day progressed, the expected return time passed. By early afternoon, their mother began watching the clock. She assumed they had missed the bus. She assumed they would arrive late. But as time stretched on, routine gave way to concern. By mid-afternoon, concern became fear. The children had never stayed away this long before. They had never failed to return without explanation. By evening, the reality could no longer be avoided. Police were contacted. At first, the response was measured. Children went missing temporarily. Buses were missed. Time slipped. But as hours passed and no sightings were confirmed, the seriousness of the situation became undeniable. Searches began that night. Officers went to the beach. They searched nearby parks. They asked shop owners and bystanders if they had seen the children. Nothing. No abandoned towels. No belongings left behind. No belongings left behind. No sign that anything had gone wrong. The next day, the search expanded. Volunteers joined police. The coastline was examined. Drainage systems were checked. Nothing. And this absence would define the case. Because there was no scene to reconstruct, no location where investigators could say with certainty this is where it happened. Everything depended on memory. And memory fades. As days passed, witnesses came forward in large numbers. Some claimed to have seen the children later in the afternoon. Others insisted they had seen them with the same man earlier in the day. Descriptions overlapped, but did not align perfectly. Times conflicted. Details shifted. The man's appearance varied slightly depending on who was speaking. Investigators were left with fragments. And fragments do not form conclusions. As the days turned into weeks, the case captured the nation's attention. Newspapers printed photographs of the children. Radio broadcasts appealed for information. Sightings were reported from across Australia. None were confirmed. Each unverified lead added to the confusion. Each false hope delayed acceptance of a darker possibility. For the family, time moved differently. Days were measured in waiting, in listening, in hoping for a knock at the door. Without evidence of death, hope does not disappear. It stretches, it survives, it refuses to end. And that refusal becomes its own burden. Years later, investigators would return to that ordinary morning again and again. They would ask the same questions. What changed? When did routine become danger? Where did certainty give way to silence? But the answers were never found, because the day had begun too normally. Because nothing marked the moment when everything shifted, and that is what made the disappearance of the Beaumont children so enduringly disturbing. Not the presence of violence, but the absence of it. Not what was seen, but what was never found. After leaving their home that morning, the Beaumont children followed a route they already knew. This was not a first journey. It was not an experiment. It was part of a routine that had worked before. The walk to the bus stop was short and familiar. Streets that had been crossed many times. Corners that felt safe. Houses that looked the same as they always had. Jane walked slightly ahead of her siblings, not because she was told to, but because that was the role she naturally took. She knew where they were going. She knew what was expected of her. Arna stayed close, moving in step, talking as they walked. Grant followed behind, small enough to still see the world as something uncomplicated and immediate. To anyone who might have noticed them, they looked ordinary. 3 children walking together on a public holiday morning did not stand out. It did not invite concern. It did not register as unusual. That is how familiarity works. When something fits into an expected pattern, the brain dismisses it as background. The bus arrived as scheduled. Public transport on Australia Day was quieter than usual, but not empty. Other families boarded. Beach bags and towels were visible. Conversations were casual. The children took their seats. No one later recalled anything unusual about the ride. There was no argument, no distress, no moment that would later feel significant. This matters. Because when something truly goes wrong, memory often anchors itself to disruption. There was none. The journey to Glenelg's beach unfolded the way it was supposed to. The bus followed its route, moving from residential streets toward a more open coastal environment. Buildings thinned. The air changed slightly. The ocean grew closer. When the bus reached Glenelg, the children stepped off into a space designed for leisure. This transition from suburb to beach is important. Public spaces like Glenelg feel safe not because they are controlled, but because they are shared. People assume that danger announces itself, that it looks obvious, that it draws attention. But danger does not need privacy. It only needs normality. Glenelg Beach that morning was active. People walked along the shoreline. Children played in the sand. Others sat nearby, watching the water or talking quietly. Movement was constant, and constant movement creates anonymity. No one person is responsible for watching anyone else. Everyone assumes someone else is paying attention. The Beaumont children blended into this environment seamlessly. They were exactly where children were supposed to be. This is why what happened next did not register as a moment, because nothing about the setting suggested risk. The children had arrived without incident. They had not been followed. They had not been delayed. They had not been separated. Everything up to this point remained within expectation. And expectation dulls caution. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths of the case. The disappearance did not begin with a dramatic moment. It began after a series of normal ones. In later years, investigators and psychologists would look closely at this journey, not because something went wrong during it, but because nothing did. There was no single point where the children crossed into danger. No visible boundary. No sudden shift. The bus stop, the ride, the beach, each step felt safe on its own. And safety, when repeated often enough, becomes invisible. That invisibility is what allowed whatever happened next to occur unnoticed. Because by the time the children reached Glenelg Beach, they were already surrounded by people, and yet they were alone. By the time the Beaumont children reached the beach, the day had fully opened up. The sand was warm, the shoreline was busy, the atmosphere was relaxed in the way public holidays often are. Nothing about the setting suggested danger. People were scattered across the beach in small groups. Families sat near one another. Children moved in and out of the water. Adults watched from towels and benches, their attention divided between conversations and the ocean. This is important to understand. Glenelg Beach was not isolated. It was not quiet. It was not hidden. It was open, public, and visible. And yet, visibility does not equal protection. Multiple witnesses would later say they saw the Beaumont children playing near the water. They were doing exactly what children were expected to do. Running along the shoreline, digging in the sand, moving freely. They did not appear frightened. They did not appear upset. They did not appear rushed. At some point during the morning, witnesses noticed something else. The children were not alone. They were speaking with a man. The interaction did not draw attention because it did not feel inappropriate. The man did not loom over them. He did not touch them aggressively. He did not behave in a way that suggested urgency or control. To the people who saw them, the scene appeared ordinary. That ordinariness would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Because when danger looks ordinary, it passes unnoticed. Witnesses described the man as tall and well-built, neatly dressed, well-spoken. He did not match the image people associate with threat. In the mid-1960s, appearance carried enormous weight. A man who looked respectable was assumed to be respectable. Trust was visual. No one intervened because there was nothing to intervene in. The children did not look distressed. They did not try to pull away. They did not look like they needed help. If anything, they looked comfortable. This detail would shape the investigation for decades, because comfort implies familiarity, or at least the illusion of it. Psychologists understand that trust does not require time, it requires confidence.
Someone who speaks calmly, behaves naturally, and does not rush immediately lowers suspicion, especially in public spaces, especially around children. Witnesses later recalled that the children seemed relaxed in the man's presence. They spoke openly. They stayed close. They did not act guarded. This suggested that whatever happened did not begin with force. It began with acceptance.
And acceptance is far more difficult to detect than resistance. At the time, no one thought to question why an adult was speaking with 3 children. Parents were nearby. Other adults were present. The environment felt self-policing. That assumption would later prove false. When witnesses were interviewed, their accounts shared a common theme. They noticed the interaction only in passing. It was not memorable until it became significant, and by then, memory had already begun to change. Some witnesses believed the man stayed with the children for an extended period. Others recalled seeing him briefly. Some remembered him walking with them. Others remembered him standing nearby. None could say precisely when the interaction began or ended. Time blurred. Context shifted. Memory adjusted to the story it was now attached to. This is how ordinary moments become distorted after tragedy. The brain fills in gaps with logic. If something bad happened, then the moments before it must have been important. But importance is assigned after the fact. At the time, there was no reason to remember the man clearly. He did not stand out. That was the problem. Witnesses later tried to reconstruct his appearance. Hair color varied slightly. Clothing descriptions conflicted. Each witness was confident. Confidence does not equal accuracy. Investigators were left with a composite that could fit many people. A man who looked like he belonged. And people who belong do not draw attention. One of the most disturbing realizations in the Beaumont case is that the disappearance may have happened without a single dramatic moment. No screams, no chase, no visible struggle. If the children left the beach with the man, they may have done so willingly, not because they understood the danger, but because they did not perceive any. This possibility challenged public assumptions about safety. It suggested that danger does not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it arrives politely. Witnesses would later replay the scene in their minds. They would ask themselves why they didn't question it, why they didn't look closer, why they didn't intervene. But hindsight changes perception. At the time, there was no alarm. The beach continued to move around them. People came and went. The moment passed. And when the children failed to return home later that day, that moment became frozen in memory. Re-examined. Reinterpreted. But never clarified. Because the man was never identified, and the interaction was never documented. It existed only in recollection. And recollection, once shaped by tragedy, cannot be trusted fully. The beach did not reveal answers.
It revealed a truth far more unsettling, that sometimes the most dangerous interactions look like nothing at all.
At some point during the morning, Jane Beaumont was seen inside a bakery near Glenelg Beach. On the surface, this moment meant nothing. Children get hungry. Beach trips involve food. Buying snacks was part of the routine. What made the moment stand out was not the purchase itself. It was the money. Jane paid using a £1 note. In 1966, this was not pocket change.
For a child, especially one traveling with younger siblings, it was an unusually large amount to be carrying, enough to attract attention, enough to feel out of place. At the time, no one questioned it. The transaction was simple. The children were polite. The bakery was busy. The moment passed. It was only later, after the children failed to return home, that this detail began to matter.
When police asked the children's parents about the money, the answer was immediate and consistent. They had not given Jane a £1 note. They'd given her only enough money for bus fare and small purchases, nothing more. This introduced a first concrete inconsistency in the entire case. Up until this point, everything had been shaped by absence. No crime scene, no physical struggle, no abandoned belongings. But money is tangible. Money comes from somewhere. If Jane did not bring it with her, then someone else must have given it to her. That implication was unavoidable. Investigators focused on this detail because it suggested interaction beyond casual conversation. It suggested trust. An adult does not give a child money without some form of communication, without proximity.
Without intent. But again, the case ran into the same wall it had already hit. There was no receipt. No record of the transaction beyond the baker's memory. No surveillance footage. The bakery employee remembered the children, but memory is fragile, especially once it becomes important. The human brain does not store everyday events with precision. It stores impressions.
Once the event gained significance, those impressions began to solidify in ways that could no longer be separated from what came later. This is one of the most difficult aspects of investigating crimes built on memory. The moment something becomes meaningful, it is no longer remembered as it was. It is remembered as it is needed. Investigators tried to reconstruct how Jane might have obtained the money. They explored whether it could have been given by a stranger, whether it could have been found, whether the parents could have been mistaken. Each possibility raised more questions than answers. The parents were adamant. They had checked. They had reconsidered. They had replayed the morning repeatedly. There was no scenario in which they had given Jane that much money. This strengthened the theory that the children had been in the company of someone who appeared trustworthy, someone who felt comfortable providing money, someone who did not fear being seen. The £1 note suggested generosity. But generosity can also be a tool. Psychologists understand that small acts of kindness create obligation. They lower defenses. They establish rapport. For children, the effect is even stronger. A gift implies safety. It implies approval. It implies permission. If the man seen with the children had given Jane money, it would explain several things at once. It would explain why the children appeared relaxed. It would explain why they stayed near him. It would explain why no one questioned the interaction. But explanation is not evidence. And without evidence, the theory could not be proven. The £1 note became a symbol of everything investigators could not confirm. It was a tangible clue that could not be traced. It pointed toward involvement, but not toward identity. Years later, this detail would still trouble those who studied the case, because it represented the moment when the disappearance stopped being purely accidental. It suggested intent. Someone had engaged with the children in a way that crossed the boundary between public space and personal involvement. And yet, that boundary left no mark.
The bakery purchase exists now only as a remembered exchange, a moment that felt ordinary at the time, a moment that would later feel impossible to ignore. It is often said that crimes leave traces, but some traces exist only in memory, and memory is the least reliable record of all. The £1 note did not solve the case. It did something more unsettling.
It confirmed that something had already gone wrong, quietly, politely, and without resistance, long before anyone realized the children were missing. When police began their investigation, they were immediately confronted with a problem. Few cases survive. There was no scene. No single location where something clearly went wrong. No physical boundary where investigators could say, with confidence, that a crime had occurred. The beach revealed nothing. No clothing left behind. No overturned belongings. No footprints that led somewhere unstopped. The sand had been disturbed by thousands of feet throughout the day. Families, children, tourists, anyone who had passed through, erased whatever traces might once have existed. The ocean offered no answers either. Water searches were conducted carefully, methodically, but without a specific area to focus on. They became exercises in uncertainty. The Beaumont case did not begin with evidence. It began with absence. This forced investigators into a difficult position early on. They could not reconstruct a crime scene. They could not establish a timeline beyond the children's arrival at the beach. Instead, the entire case would depend on people, on what they thought they saw, on what they believed they remembered, on details recalled after the fact, shaped by news coverage, conversation, and time. Witness memory would become the foundation of the investigation. And witness memory is unstable. As police canvassed Glenelg Beach and the surrounding areas, dozens of people came forward. Many had seen the Beaumont children. Some had seen them playing near the water. Some had noticed them walking along the shoreline. Some had seen them talking with an adult man. Individually, these accounts seemed helpful. Together, they were inconsistent. The man described by witnesses appeared similar across most accounts, but never identical. He was described as well-groomed, respectable, somewhere between his 30s and 40s. But height varied, hair color shifted slightly, clothing descriptions conflicted. Each witness was certain, and certainty is often misleading. Psychologists understand that memory does not work like a recording. It reconstructs. Every time a memory is recalled, it is subtly altered by new information, by questions. by assumptions, by the way a story is told afterward. In the days following the disappearance, Australia was saturated with images of the Beaumont children. Their photographs appeared everywhere. Witnesses who had not thought twice about what they had seen were suddenly forced to reflect on ordinary moments. Did I see them earlier? Did I see them later? Was that the same man? These questions do not clarify memory. They contaminate it. Police attempted to organize witness statements into a coherent sequence. They struggled. Some witnesses placed the children at the beach in the early afternoon. Others insisted they saw them closer to evening. If the later sightings were true, it suggested the children remained alive for hours after they were expected home. But no proof supported those claims. Each time investigators tried to narrow the timeline, it widened instead. One detail, however, stood out more than the rest. Multiple witnesses described the children as appearing comfortable with the man they were seen with. This was not a fleeting interaction. It was not a moment of fear. They spoke to him openly. They walked near him willingly. In some accounts, they appeared to trust him. This detail shaped the investigation profoundly. It suggested that the children did not perceive immediate danger. It suggested familiarity, or at least the illusion of safety. This narrowed the type of person investigators were looking for, not someone who used force in public, not someone who acted impulsively, but someone who blended in, someone whose appearance did not attract attention, someone who did not look like a threat. That made the case harder, not easier. Because such people exist everywhere. One particularly troubling report involved Jane Beaumont purchasing food from a nearby bakery. The transaction itself was ordinary. What was not ordinary was the money. Jane reportedly paid with a £1 note. For a child of her age, that amount was unusual. Her parents were adamant. They had not given her that much money. The implication was unavoidable. Someone else had. But investigators faced the same obstacle again. No receipt. No documentation. No way to verify the claim beyond testimony. The baker remembered the interaction, but memory is shaped by significance. Once the case became known, the moment acquired meaning it did not originally have. The brain does this naturally. It revises the past based on the present. This left police with a narrative that could not be anchored to physical proof. Every potential lead dissolved under scrutiny. The case quickly gained national attention. Tips flooded in from across the country. Some claimed to have seen the children days later. Others claimed to recognize the man described by witnesses. Names were offered. Suspects were proposed. None could be substantiated. Each false lead drained resources and emotional energy. Investigators began to realize that the case might never produce the kind of evidence they needed. There was no ransom demand, no communication, no attempt to exploit the disappearance. This eliminated many conventional kidnapping scenarios. The absence of contact suggested that whatever had happened was not ongoing. But without proof of harm, police could not declare the children deceased. The case hovered in a state of unresolved tension. As weeks passed, public confidence began to fracture. People questioned how 3 children could disappear in broad daylight. Some blamed police, others blamed the changing nature of society. But the truth was simpler and more unsettling. Public spaces feel safe because danger is rare, not because it is impossible. Crowds create comfort. They also create invisibility. Investigators revisited the idea that the man seen with the children may have been known to them. Perhaps not personally, but through brief interactions. Someone who had spoken to them before. Someone who had earned trust incrementally. This theory explained the children's behavior. It explained the lack of struggle. And it explained why witnesses did not intervene, because nothing looked wrong. Years later, police would revisit potential suspects. Some were investigated intensely. One man in particular drew attention. Searches were conducted. Land was excavated. Investigators hoped for remains. They found nothing. Once again, the case returned to silence. No forensic breakthrough ever emerged. No confession was verified. No definitive explanation took hold. The Beaumont disappearance remained defined by uncertainty, not because investigators failed to care, but because the crime left almost nothing behind. As time passed, the case transitioned from active investigation to historical mystery, but for the family, it never transitioned at all. Without evidence, grief could not complete its cycle. There was no confirmation, no closure, only waiting. Psychologically, unresolved loss behaves differently than confirmed death. It suspends mourning. It traps the mind in possibility, and possibility is exhausting. The Beaumont children were not just missing. They were permanently unresolved, and that unresolved state became the case's most enduring feature. Decades later, investigators and psychologists would still study the disappearance, not for answers, but for what it revealed about human perception, about memory, about trust, about how easily certainty can collapse when evidence is absent. The Beaumont case remains a lesson written in absence, a reminder that not all crimes announce themselves. Some pass quietly through ordinary days, leaving nothing behind but questions. As the afternoon passed and the expected return time came and went, the Beaumont household grew quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. At first, the delay did not feel alarming. Children miss buses. Time slips by at the beach. Plans change. Their mother assumed the children would walk through the door at any moment, slightly late, slightly sunburned, ready with simple explanations. But minutes turned into hours. The house remained still. By mid-afternoon, concern began to replace patience. There was no sound of footsteps, no voices outside, no bus stopping nearby. Each small noise from the street drew attention, then disappointment. When evening approached, the unease deepened. The children had never stayed away this long before.
They had never failed to return without contacting home. What had begun as routine now felt wrong. Their mother began retracing the day in her mind. The conversation in the morning, the instructions she had given, the time they had left. She searched for a moment that could explain the delay. There was none. As darkness settled, fear became unavoidable. Police were contacted.
That phone call marked a shift that would never fully reverse. Once authorities became involved, the possibility of danger could no longer be ignored. Yet even then, hope remained. Hope is persistent when there is no proof of harm. The idea that the children might simply be lost, delayed, or confused clung tightly to the family. That hope did not disappear overnight. It stretched. It adjusted. It survived far longer than logic would allow. In the early days, the family lived in a constant state of anticipation. Every phone call felt significant. Every knock at the door carried possibility. They slept lightly. They listened constantly. The absence of information became its own form of noise. As days passed, the house filled with uncertainty. The children's belongings remained untouched, beds unmade, shoes still by the door. Nothing had been packed away. To pack would be to accept something no one was ready to accept. Without confirmation of death, grief could not fully form. It hovered instead, suspended. Psychologists describe this state as ambiguous loss, a type of loss without resolution. The person is gone, but not proven gone. The mind cannot complete the process of mourning, because there is no ending to mourn. This state is uniquely exhausting. It forces the family to live between hope and despair, unable to settle into either. The Beaumont parents experienced this uncertainty daily. They cooperated fully with police. They answered the same questions repeatedly. They revisited the same memories over and over. Each retelling reopened the wound, yet they continued. Because doing something, anything, felt better than waiting. As weeks turned into months, public attention remained intense. New leads were reported. Possible sightings emerged. Each one reignited hope. Each one eventually collapsed. The emotional cost of false hope is difficult to measure. It lifts the heart briefly, only to let it fall again. Over time, the family learned to temper expectation. But they could never let it go completely. Letting go would have felt like betrayal. Years passed. The children did not return, but the waiting did not end. The parents continued to believe that answers might still come, that somewhere, someone knew something, that the absence of evidence did not mean absence of life. The family aged alongside the unanswered questions. Birthdays passed. Anniversaries marked time instead of celebration. The children remained the same age in memory, frozen at the moment they disappeared. This is one of the quiet tragedies of unresolved cases. Time moves forward for everyone else. For the missing, it stops. And for the families, it moves unevenly, pulled backward by memory, pushed forward by necessity. Without closure, the future becomes difficult to imagine. How do you move on when the past refuses to settle? How do you grieve when there is no certainty to anchor grief? The Beaumont case did not just remove 3 children from a family. It placed that family into a permanent state of waiting, a waiting without a clear end. Even decades later, the question remained, what happened to them? Without an answer, the waiting became the legacy of the case. Not the investigation, not the headlines, but the silence that followed. Unsolved crimes behave differently in the human mind. They do not end. They do not settle into memory the way resolved cases do. Instead, they remain active, constantly reshaped by imagination, theory, and unanswered questions. When a crime is solved, the mind is given structure. There is a beginning. There is a middle. There is an end. Even when the outcome is tragic, certainty provides containment. Unsolved crimes offer no such boundaries. They exist without edges. The disappearance of the Beaumont children is not disturbing because of what is known. It is disturbing because of what is missing. No final sighting. No confirmed moment of danger. No physical proof of what occurred. The mind struggles with this absence. Humans are pattern-seeking by nature. We look for causes. We look for sequences. We look for meaning. When evidence is absent, the brain fills the gaps. This is why unsolved cases generate endless theories. Not because answers are close, but because uncertainty is intolerable. Psychologists understand that ambiguity creates cognitive tension. The mind wants resolution, and when it cannot find one, it invents possibilities. Each theory feels briefly satisfying, then it collapses under scrutiny, and the cycle begins again. In the Beaumont case, this cycle is repeated for decades. New suspects have emerged. Old leads have been revisited. Excavations have been conducted. Nothing has provided confirmation. This lack of closure forces the public and the family to live with competing realities, one where the children are gone and one where the possibility remains that they are not. This duality prevents emotional finality. It suspends grief. For families, this is particularly devastating. Grief usually follows a process: loss, acceptance, adjustment, but unresolved disappearance interrupts that sequence. The loss is felt, but never confirmed. Acceptance is postponed. Adjustment becomes impossible. Instead, families remain anchored to the moment of disappearance. Time passes around them, but they remain psychologically fixed to the past. The Beaumont parents lived within this suspension. Hope never fully left. Neither did despair. Both existed simultaneously. This psychological state is exhausting. It drains energy. It reshapes identity. It turns waiting into a permanent condition. For investigators, unsolved cases create a different burden. They represent limits. Limits of evidence. Limits of memory. Limits of human observation. The Beaumont case demonstrated how a crime could occur in public, in daylight, surrounded by people, and still leave nothing behind. It challenged assumptions about safety, about witnesses, about how crime is supposed to look. The absence of violence did not mean the absence of danger. The absence of evidence did not mean the absence of a crime. It meant the crime had been quiet, polite, invisible. This realization changed how disappearances were understood in Australia. Parents became more cautious. Children's independence narrowed. Public trust shifted. The case did not just remove 3 children from a family. It altered collective behavior. And yet, despite its impact, the case itself remained unresolved. No answers emerged to match its influence. This imbalance between significance and resolution is what keeps the Beaumont case alive in public memory. It refuses to fade because it refuses to conclude. Over time, unsolved crimes become more than investigations. They become symbols. Symbols of vulnerability. Symbols of uncertainty. Symbols of how easily routine can become irreversible. The Beaumont children left home on a day that felt safe. They followed a familiar path. They entered a public space. They were seen. They were remembered. And then they were gone. Nothing about their disappearance fit the expectations of danger, and that is precisely what made it so unsettling. In the absence of answers, the mind returns to the beginning, to the ordinary moments, to the decisions that feel harmless, because those moments now carry unbearable weight. Unsolved crimes do not ask us to remember violence. They ask us to remember absence, and absence is harder to process than pain. Pain ends. Absence does not. More than half a century later, the Beaumont children remain missing, not just from their family, but from certainty itself. The case has no ending, only silence. And silence, when it stretches across decades, becomes its own form of testimony. Not about what happened, but about how little it takes for certainty to disappear.